Mute or unmuted?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Good to
Hi,
see
Farah.
It's so good to see people.
Really?
Yes, hello.
Hi, Farah.
Hi.
Hi, hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well, thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we're ready to get started now. Welcome everyone, and thanks very much for attending this session, which will be the first in a series of events we hope that we've set up to promote and celebrate the publication of this book that I'm sure you're all aware of, the Routledge Handbook of Character Assassination and Reputation Management. My name is Martijn Icks from the University of Amsterdam, and today I'll be interviewing my esteemed colleague Jennifer Keohane. This meeting will be recorded for everyone who would like to watch it back again later. And of course, at the end of the interview, there will also be an opportunity for you to ask questions to Jenny. Okay, I think I got muted there for a second.
Sorry, that was me. I was trying to make sure we didn't have any feedback, and I muted you.
No problem. You can just do the interview by yourself. Good. I was just about to introduce Jenny, whom I'm sure most people here will already know. Anyway, she is the assistant professor at the Klein Family School of Communications Design, the University of Baltimore. She did her PhD in communication arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And among many other things, including, of course, character assassination, she is interested in issues of class, identity, feminism, and race. Jenny has recently published Feminist Voices and Communist Rhetoric in Cold War America. I haven't got that here to hold up to you, but Jenny, if you have a copy, no, not at hand. And she is also, of course, one of the editors and contributors to the Routledge Handbook of Character Assassination and Reputation Management. And in fact, today we're going to talk about her chapter in that handbook, which is about Joseph McCarthy, the communist witch hunt, and the way that McCarthy himself was taken to task by the journalist Joseph Murrow. So, Jenny, for starters, can you please explain to us once again what character assassination is, or at least what we mean by that term?
Awesome, thank you. Well, first of all, I wanted to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Martijn, for hosting our conversation this morning. And thank you to Routledge, too, for publishing and working with us to get this book from conception to publication. I would run in and grab a copy of my other book to show you, but unfortunately, that would mean you would all be able to see that I'm wearing yoga pants in addition to my blazer. So, but yeah, let's start by talking about about the sort of framework here of character assassination that we use in the book, and that kind of frames the way that I look at this particular episode. For us, character assassination refers to an intentional campaign to destroy or lower someone's reputation in the eyes of the public. Now, certainly it is the case that we can mess up and do all sorts of accidental things that also lower our reputation. But we're primarily talking in the handbook about intentional strategic communication designed to lower someone's reputation. Now, people who engage in character assassination do so to gain some type of advantage, whether it's political or social and that type of thing. Character attacks can be true or they can be false. Character attackers can be anonymous or they can be known figures. And character attacks themselves can be sort of a long, drawn-out campaign, or they can be sort of a drive-by kind of cheap shot. And the first chapter of our handbook that Martijn introduced you to gives a little bit more of an in-depth typology for what we're talking about.
Yes, thank you very much. And perhaps you could also tell us a bit about your own research and what led you to this topic. So what first got you interested in character assassination? And how does it relate to other interests that you have as an academic?
Yeah, my academic training is in rhetoric, and rhetoric is a fancy word for persuasion. So rhetoricians are interested in how speakers or persuaders craft messages amidst certain constraints and in certain contexts in order to reach particular audiences. And character assassination is fundamentally about audience, right? Character attacks work when the public or the audience thinks that they work or is persuaded by them. So I'm interested in seeing character assassination as a rhetorical or a communication exchange whereby someone makes kind of a strategic calculus that they want to attack someone and then crafts a message that will do so. Generally, my research looks at the rhetoric of the American labor movement and how advocates for labor causes, whether it's higher wages or unionization, have made arguments to change their working conditions. And those of you who have a historical background or know something about the American labor movement during the 20th century know that red baiting or accusations of being affiliated with the Communist Party were really, really common as a way to kind of take down labor advocates. And as a result, I think we can see this form of character attack, what we would call kind of a guilt by association attack, as really important for understanding what the American labor movement was able to achieve. The other thing I would say is rhetoricians are often interested, and I suspect you'll hear me talk more about this later, but are interested in sort of credibility and character too. So I am also interested in thinking about, well, where does character come from in the first place? And how do we communicate our characters and our personalities to the audience?
Yes, and if I understand correctly, character is a term that has quite a long rhetorical history, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about character. And in the chapter that I contributed to the handbook, I actually look at 3 different ways of communicating character, but kind of our root word there is ethos, which is a term that loosely means for rhetoricians credibility. And so one of the key arguments that I make in the chapter is that Edward R. Murrow's journalistic attack on Senator McCarthy succeeded primarily because Murrow very credibly built his attack, and his credible attack was supported by what we might call prior ethos, or the sense that the public had that he was a credible, trustworthy person in the public sphere, which relates to his role as a journalist that goes back to him covering London during World War II.
Yeah. So, but before we move on to Murrow and McCarthy in a bit more depth, perhaps you could also tell us a bit about CARP, because that's of course how we know each other. We've known each other for quite a few years by now. So could you explain to us what CARP is exactly, when it was founded, what it is there for, and how it goes about achieving its goals?
Absolutely. So CARP, or CARP Lab, is our term for this kind of loose coalition of interdisciplinary scholars who are interested in understanding and studying character assassination and reputation, large, sort of broadly construed. So we look at character assassination from a variety of perspectives: history, rhetoric, psychology. And CARP Lab provides kind of the framework, or sort of a home organization for people who are interested in studying and understanding these things. Now, Martijn Icks and Sergei Samolenko and I officially created CARP back in 2015 at George Mason, although our work there came out of a longer history that you and Eric actually had of working together. When was the Heidelberg conference?
Oh, that was in 2011.
Okay.
I think it's almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. And so CARP then, sort of a later iteration of some work that Martijn and Eric had started, hosted conferences at George Mason University in 2017 and 2019, and participated in organizing an international symposium in Vienna in February 2020, which actually feels like 15 years ago, back when we were allowed to travel and go places.
Oh,
right?
yes, those were the days. Right.
But so I guess the last thing I'll say is broadly, CARP is interested in researching character assassination, teaching the public about it, and thinking about risk assessment for public figures as well. But many of us consider our main hats to be as scholars, as academics who research this, but again, from a variety of interdisciplinary perspectives.
Yes, yes, definitely. So let's move on to your chapter in the handbook, which I very much enjoyed reading, and of course studied again to prepare for this interview. Now, I think many people have heard about McCarthy. Even I, not being an American citizen, knew about McCarthy and the Red Scare, the witch hunt. But could you perhaps briefly summarize exactly, paint us a picture, who McCarthy was, when he was at the height of his power, and why he was such a controversial figure in his time?
Absolutely. So Joseph McCarthy was a Republican senator from Wisconsin, and he served in the Senate from 1947 to 1957, which is actually when he died. He died in office. And McCarthy was the most visible face of really rampant, hysterical anti-communism in the United States. And so he traveled the country alleging that the US government was overrun and infiltrated with communists and communist sympathizers. Now, this is the early Cold War. The United States is sort of in this stalemate with Soviet Russia about who's the most powerful country in the world, and which is the most powerful system of economic organization, capitalism or communism, which is why sort of being virulently anti-communist got him so noticed in the media. But so McCarthy was primarily known for his methods of trying to root out communists from the government. So he used smear tactics and browbeating, public hearings. He made government officials sign loyalty oaths. And it was so intense that the Senate actually censured him or scolded him in 1954. So in the United States, McCarthyism has become the term that we use to refer to hysterical anti-communism. Although I do think it's important to note that kind of the broader apparatus of being really anti-communist extended far beyond just Senator McCarthy himself. The courts were on board, other private corporations were also engaging in these types of behaviors. But he was really at the height of his power in the early 1950s. And in fact, 1954, when the communication exchange that I'm studying in this chapter happens, he's sort of on the down slope of his influence, and the tide is starting to turn against him. Later in 1954, we'll get the Army McCarthy hearings, which were broadcast on ABC to millions of homes, and this is where we get the "at long last have you no sense of decency, sir," line that's pretty famous in US history, which was used to indicate that McCarthy had really gone overboard in terms of really trying to pummel his message into other people. But so all of this is to say, in 1954, his influence is starting to wane. And partially that's because the American Communist Party is losing influence as well. But McCarthyism, in short, refers to this system of hysterical anti-communism, and he was really the most visible face and proponent of that.
Yeah, I guess you can say you've made it big if your name becomes an ism.
That's right, that's right.
It is a negative ism in this case, maybe. So you already also briefly introduced us to Joseph Murrow, a very prominent journalist with a very good reputation, a good ethos with the American public. Now Murrow decided in his TV show to attack Joseph McCarthy and his policies. How did he go about that, and what did viewers think of his efforts?
Yeah, so Murrow was a prominent TV journalist at the time, and as I mentioned, he had gotten his start during World War II and was sort of a trusted newsman. People felt comforted when he was giving them updates. And he was the host of a television reporting show called See It Now, which aired on CBS. And he and his producer put together a 30-minute report on Joseph McCarthy that really came across and resonated as a credible character attack on McCarthy. To give you a little sense of what the report actually looked like, it's sort of an argumentative essay. There's an editorial introduction and a conclusion where you see Murrow himself on the screen talking to the audience and providing a framing of what you're about to see. And then in the body of the attack, what Murrow and his producers have done is spliced together video, images, and audio of Senator McCarthy himself engaging in these methods and this browbeating and these really nasty smears. So the senator himself becomes the voice of hysteria. Murrow and his producer spent about 18 months gathering and recording footage, and at the end of it they had 1,500 feet of film that they then kind of cut and edited together. And the reaction to the report was immediate and positive. CBS was deluged with phone calls and letters praising Murrow for his brave reporting. The New York Times called him courageous and said it was television's finest hour. Now, none of that is to say that Murrow's report wasn't controversial. In an era when TV news was really seen as credible and unbiased, it was pretty clear that the report on McCarthy was not unbiased. It was designed to show him in a negative light. But that was really the only negative comment that Murrow and his team got. Otherwise, people were very praiseworthy of the work he had done to illustrate how out of control Senator McCarthy had become. And so in the chapter in our handbook, what I'm trying to do is rhetorically analyze the exchange between Murrow and McCarthy to understand why Murrow's attack worked so well and McCarthy's response to Murrow's report really didn't go over very well at all.
Yeah, but when I see the footage of McCarthy, he comes across to me as a bully that no one dared to speak up to until finally somebody does. Would that be a right impression? Is that what people thought about him at the time?
I think that's absolutely right, that Murrow comes across very courageous, as standing up to the bully, speaking truth to power, when everyone else had been so sort of cowed by McCarthy's seeming relentless attacks and seeming relentless accusations of the influence of communists. Yeah, I think that's an accurate characterization.
Yeah, so it was quite an attack that McCarthy faced. How did he respond to it? And did his response work out for him or not?
So interestingly, Murrow knew that his report was going to be controversial, and he prized his role as a relatively unbiased newsman. So in the original report, which aired in March 1954, Murrow invited McCarthy to respond and said, send us a tape, we'll play it, and you can tell me what you think of this. And so McCarthy does respond, but there are a couple of problems with McCarthy's response, one of which is that he waits a month to do it, which one can understand, right? It took Murrow and his producers a year and a half to put together their report, but you know, Murrow's report aired to immediate acclaim, and the public has a short attention span. So when McCarthy finally sent his tape to Murrow, the attention just wasn't there. Likewise, I think that McCarthy sort of didn't estimate correctly just how influential Murrow's report was. And in fact, if you watch McCarthy's response, he basically confirms everything that Murrow had said, which is that he's out of control, he's freewheeling, he doesn't pay attention to evidence. And so if you watch McCarthy's response, he's sitting behind a desk with a globe off to his side, but he comes across completely ranting. There's no clear structure of response to his points. He again hurls accusations without evidence, accusing Murrow himself of being a communist. He treats the absence of evidence as evidence itself by saying, well, we can't prove this didn't happen, so that must mean it did. And so all of that is to say, he really underestimated the fact that the tide was really turning against him, and that the fitting rhetorical response would have been to issue a far more careful refutation of Murrow's points instead of kind of doing what he had always done before.
Yeah, so did this destroy McCarthy's career? Can we go that far, do you think? So
that's what a lot of historians and media folks have claimed, that this was the moment that brought down McCarthy. I think, and certainly I'm not the only person who has investigated this a little bit further, I think that's giving Murrow more credit than he deserves. Certainly it helped, but public opinion had really already started to turn against McCarthy. And so I think if we think about it as a wave, Murrow's report was kind of in the middle of the wave starting to crest. It wasn't the beginning of public opinion turning against him. And in fact, Eisenhower had started to distance himself from McCarthy before the report. But I do think that if we look at the combination of this report and then the Army McCarthy hearings about a month later, it becomes pretty clear why later that year, 1954, the Senate would ultimately say, like, you got to cut it out, man. Like, this is too much.
Yeah. So you've mentioned this term ethos a couple of times. Perhaps you could also call it character. They seem to be pretty similar. And ethos seems to have been on the side of Murrow in this exchange, and really have helped him to make his case. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So I think ethos is a concept that has a really long history in rhetorical studies as one of Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion. You may remember from intro speech classes, ethos, pathos, and logos. If pathos is emotion and logos is logic, ethos is about credibility, right? And the character of the speaker. Now, there's a couple of different ways that rhetoricians have studied ethos. It's both something that the audience perceives about the speaker before they speak, but it's also something that the speaker themselves can build in their message, right? And so Murrow both had a strong, what we would call prior ethos. The audience trusted him. But he also did a very careful job of building his ethos within his report as well, right? Because he had a careful structure. He narrated for his audience what he wanted them to get out of the report, and he included strong evidence from McCarthy himself that really was powerful evidence for the claims he was making. And so I think what this episode can show us is that character assassination is far more likely to work if attackers demonstrate both themselves to be credible, but also build credibility in the attacks.
Yes, yeah. So in rhetoric, a term that you often hear is the ad hominem, literally an argument to the man attacking someone personally. And when you look at rhetorical handbooks, for instance, it's often listed as a fallacy, something that you actually shouldn't do. It's not a genuine way of arguing. Do you agree with that? And do you think an ad hominem is something that you shouldn't do as a rhetorician?
That's an interesting question, and it's one that we at CARP and me as a rhetorician have thought a lot about as I've turned more to studying character assassination. Is it, can we treat character assassination as the same thing as an ad hominem attack? What are the differences in that kind of thing? But, I think for our purposes here, Martijn, you're absolutely right that argumentation handbooks give you a list of logical fallacies and they say don't use these in argument, and ad hominem is often at the top.
Yes.
Now, there are a lot of argument scholars who suggest that actually we might think more about ad hominem as something that can be warranted and can be useful in certain moments. Douglas Walton is one of the pioneering scholars here, and as I recall, he recently passed away. And he says, well, actually, personal characteristics and the character of a person is relevant to arguments or discussions we might have. It matters, for instance, if a politician is running on a family values platform and they're also doing drugs and having an affair, right? Like, it's not an irrelevant attack on their personality. It actually matters quite deeply.
Yes.
And so relevance kind of becomes the key method here. Like, is the ad hominem attack or the question of character relevant to the determination that the public is trying to make? And I it's hard to answer yes or no, but it certainly does seem like McCarthy's investigation methods mattered to his presence in the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the 1950s is when this is all happening. When I think of the 1950s, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is this is really the age of TV. This is when TV is really becoming mainstream in the United States. More and more people have a TV at their home, and TV has a huge impact. So this was, you could say, a new medium at the time, a medium that Murrow managed to use very effectively for his character assassination of McCarthy. Do you think that perhaps McCarthy underestimated how important the power of TV was? And did TV change the rules of the game in politics in general and practices of character assassination in particular?
TV was a definite factor here. And TV news as a medium being seen as incredibly trusted is important, right? So we kind of give advantage Murrow here. And using television allows Murrow to do what we might consider a visual character attack, right? So there are moments in Murrow's report where we see McCarthy all sweaty with his greasy hair falling over his forehead. So there's a visual character attack happening here as well. Mm-hmm. Now, I do think that we should give McCarthy some credit. He was no stranger to the power of television and the spectacle, right? He got his start and earned his fame doing speaking tours around the country where he would actually like hold up sheets of paper and say, I have a list of communists in the government. Spoiler alert, he didn't. It was just a sheet of paper.
Oh, right, yeah.
But that was a powerful visual medium for him. So McCarthy knew something about the visual spectacle, but he just could not overcome the trusted news persona that Murrow was able to advance here.
Yeah. Okay, so when we look back at this very famous case of character assassination, what would you say the main points are that we, as scholars, you as a rhetorician, but also other people interested in character assassination from other disciplines, what should we take away from this? What can we learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I think is really important is that Murrow was able to succeed because his own character was seen as very trustworthy in the eyes of the public. So I think beyond just looking at character assassination, we have to look at how speakers and attackers build their own character in their communication messages. And so looking at how character is communicated more broadly and not just at how it's assassinated, I think is something that we really get from this case. I also think that this case reminds us that character assassination is a time-bound phenomenon, right? That timing matters. Rhetoricians call this kairos, but it mattered that McCarthy waited a month to respond. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is that this case provides an interesting springboard for thinking about the moral and ethical implications of character assassination. And this gets a little bit at what Douglas Walton studies in terms of ad hominem attacks. But the question becomes then, was Murrow justified in launching his attack? And it's hard to say yes or no, but at the end of the day, like, it does seem like having McCarthy lose power and influence in the Senate is probably a good thing in terms of thinking about reducing the climate of hysteria that was occurring in the United States. So I think sort of the moral and ethical quandaries of character assassination are tied up here as well. And although this case may not give us an easy answer, you know, it's something that scholars of character assassination and citizens who engage in the public sphere should think about.
Yes. Speaking just for myself, when I look back at this footage, I'm certainly inclined to be more sympathetic towards Murrow than towards McCarthy. So I understand what you mean about, can a character attack perhaps sometimes be justified? Now, I also want to open the floor to questions from our audience, but just to make sure that not everyone starts speaking at once, I would ask you either to make use of the chat function where you can type your question and I will read it out loud and Jenny will answer it, or to raise a virtual hand. There is an option that you can put a raise hand icon that I ask my students to use in class as well. And then I'll say when you can ask your question, you can ask it yourself and unmute your microphone for a bit. So I see there's already a question from Sergei Samoylenko in the chat box. He says, what can my students learn from this story prior to the 2020 election?
Yeah, you know, in some ways, there's a very different media climate now than there was back then. And so I think in some ways, this story here is kind of a useful counterpoint to thinking about the way that television news works these days. I mean, I think so many people sort of regret how politicized and polarized things like cable news, whether it's MSNBC versus Fox News, are these days. And so one of the things that's interesting about the Murrow-McCarthy sort of exchange is that television news was assumed to be relatively unbiased and trustworthy. And so that's not a starting point that we would, I think, say these days. And I think the other thing too that's really different about the Murrow-McCarthy exchange versus the way that news exists in the political realm today is soundbite culture. So Murrow's report on McCarthy was 30 minutes long, and McCarthy's report was about that same length. And so, you know, the move to shorter and shorter sound bites that get sort of recirculated on Twitter and social media and that kind of thing is a different a mode of engaging in public and political discourse. And so I realized that I have identified like key differences here. but so maybe that's kind of one of the things that we can see, and that having students study this case might be a useful way to reflect on how kind of the media architecture or infrastructure looks today, and how that changes what our political discourse looks like.
Yeah, thank you. I see several other questions popping up in the chat box. So I've got one here from Rod Carviff. What was the impact of Murrow's earlier broadcast about Sergeant Milo Radulovic, and didn't that help set up the Murrow versus McCarthy exchange? Could you tell us who Radulovic was?
So I'm fuzzy on the details here because it's been a long time since I have read more extensively about See It Now. But my understanding was Radulovic was an Air Force pilot who was sort of wrongly accused of communist sympathies. And as I recall, well, so See It Now, the program that Murrow and his producers ran, did an episode on Radulovic prior to the report on Joseph McCarthy. But so all of this is to say, what that report did was sort of cement, and again, the finer points of what exactly happened to this gentleman, I'll admit that I don't remember. But what this report did was, again, continue to solidify Murrow's television show as a news source that was really good at telling stories of people who had been kind of swept up in the hysteria of McCarthyism. So if anything, this report, I think, sort of sets the scene that, you know, McCarthy's hysteria browbeating has victims, right? Like, there is a real human cost to letting this type of irresponsible discourse continue unabated.
Yes, thanks. A question from Kathy Wright. Could you please speak to the elements of credibility of both parties and why people believe them, or one more than the other? It seems that some people feel that elected officials automatically have credibility, but that shouldn't always be true.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? And so certainly if we think about this concept of prior ethos, and again, given what we know about television news in the 1950s, you know, people were predisposed to trust Murrow. You know, whether, I think our view of credibility for McCarthy himself needs to be understood sort of as we think about the way that McCarthyism played out. Now, it is definitely the case that in midterm elections in 48 and 50, every time the Republican Party forced the soft on communism label on their opponents, that the opponents lost, right? And so in the late 1940s, early 1950s, being soft on communism was not an option, right? And so in that sense, I think that people would have been predisposed to see McCarthy as a credible source, as someone who was very anti-communism and on sort of the front line of being anti-communism. But again, by 1954, things had started to change. It was becoming more and more clear that the American Communist Party was weak and disorganized. Eisenhower himself had started like skipping meetings with McCarthy and not answering his phone calls. So yeah, I mean, any sort of credible ethos that McCarthy would have had as an elected official is starting to wane at this point. Although I think, you know, it's interesting. Do we, in the United States at least, do we automatically give elected officials credibility?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe,
that's a good question.
Maybe, but I kind of think that is changing, right? And that I think a lot of Americans, and I'm speaking in sort of generalities here, are actually inclined to see politicians as not trustworthy, as people who will say anything to get elected. Now, there are certain politicians that have created and cultivated ethos of genuine authenticity and trustworthiness over long careers, but that's certainly not true for everybody.
Yeah. In your opinion, does mimetic culture meme production affect the change from the 1950s to the 2020s?
Absolutely. And so we might see, you know, if we start with like long form reporting, then we move to TV news sound bites, maybe memes are quite kind of the next thing, right? But certainly I think what memes do is mean that no one can get away with any mistake, right? Even the smallest gaffe or mistake becomes turned into a meme and recirculated through political discourse. And so I think that, you know, I'm not a media effects scholar, but, you know, we might want to do more research, and this is probably already being done, about whether memes have made the American public more cynical and less trustworthy and that kind of thing. But one of the things that I do think memes do well is capitalize on this element of visual culture, right, that we talked about earlier. So seeing the images recirculate through social media is a visual mode of engaging with questions of character.
Yeah, just a comment from Kanwalpreet. We are seeing the building of mass hysteria that you are talking about in India since the past few years, and it is shredding apart the delicate fabric of Indian secularism. I'm not sure how well versed you are in current Indian politics, but would you like to comment on that?
So I guess I will say one of the things that scholars who study invective or nasty speech have noted is that it's important to think about what those types of speech do to the audience. And so Jeremy Ingalls is a rhetorical scholar who studies the early republic, the founding of the United States, and he wants us to remember that the America's founding fathers were just as nasty as people are today, right? There are quotes from like the earliest pages of Congress calling opponents slugs trailing slime on the floor of the Senate. And let's remember, not at least one person actually got beat up on the floor of Congress back in the day.
It doesn't happen that often nowadays anymore.
No. The caning of Sumner. But so all of that is to say, like, I think Kanwalpreet's point is really well taken, that if democracy is about trust, it's hard to think about a society that continually spreads invective as building trust among citizens. And so Jeremy Ingalls' work speaks to this a little bit, as does Danielle Allen, who is at the University of Chicago. She writes a lot about how democracy requires trust. And so I think that's a really great point, to recognize that, you know, even outside of the question of effective versus ineffective, there are broader implications that we need to consider as well.
Yeah, another question from Rod. When you talk about McCarthy's waning influence, isn't there a difference between his political influence and his popular influence? For example, when McCarthy started going after the army in 1953, he lost the support of Eisenhower, while in February 1954, his support in the Gallup poll hit its highest mark of 50% approval versus 29% disapproval.
Yeah, that's an important point, right? A very important one. So thanks for bringing that up, Rod. Certainly when we think about political influence, the ability to command the resources to do investigations and to stage these spectacles like the Army McCarthy hearings requires a level of political influence. But I do think that recognizing that, you know, there were a number of people, and that this of course lasted well into the 60s and 70s, that were very worried about the influence of communism and kind of leftist ideals more generally, that would have still seen McCarthy as a credible figure. That's a great point.
Yep. Okay, I've reached the end of the questions in the chat box, so I'll look around and see if anyone else wants to ask Jenny any questions. And now is your chance to speak up.
Would you like to plug next week's webinar, Martijn?
Definitely, yes, because we have another interview lined up next week. Sergei Samoilenko will interview Eric Sharayev, both at George Mason University. What can we learn from psychology, character assassination, psychology? Are there inborn character attackers? Are there psychological features that make us vulnerable to character attacks? And also, there are some earlier questions in the chat. Oh, this isn't actually part of the announcement. I'm reading it. So it stops with, are there psychological features that make us vulnerable to character attacks? ... question mark. Okay, in that case, I want to thank everyone for attending this session. We'll make sure that the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. Thanks very much, Jenny, for taking the time to answering our questions. And we hope to see all of you back again next week for the next session.
Thank you so much for great questions and for chatting with us. We at CARP hope you all are staying safe, and we look forward to being able to gather with you at a conference or just at a bar sometime soon. Thank you for your support of studying character assassination, and we'll chat with you next week.
Goodbye.
Mm-hmm.